first off, we're very vertically integrated. So we manufacture these solenoid valves, but we make almost everything that goes into the valve.
Just a quick reminder for you to like, subscribe, and rate this podcast so we can get your feedback and know how to make it better.
Hey, it's Ari. Welcome to another episode of the Made in America podcast. Today, we're with Mark Mangiafico, president of Peter Paul. Mark, thank you so much for coming on today.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, it's my pleasure. It's the Made in America podcast, Mark. So we always start off with the same two questions. What do you make and why do you make it?
Well, what do we make? We make engineered flow-controlled solutions, typically centered around solenoid valves. And why do we make them? Because there's a need for high-quality solenoid-based flow control solutions out there. And tough applications are our calling. So that's our niche.
Yeah, you enjoy solving those tough problems, do you?
And that's the deal, yeah.
That's the deal. Well, I don't know if a lot of people out there kind of really know about solenoid valves and flow controls and what they're used for. So let's just sort of start by kind of level setting on that. Like maybe explain to the layperson out there, first start off with like, what is flow control? Why does someone need it?
Okay, well, if you're trying to control a fluid, you need to turn it on, turn it off, divert it, typically done through a valve. If you ever walk into a bathroom and you put your hands underneath the spigot and it turns on, well, it's usually a solenoid valve that is energizing and turning on the water flow. You wash your hands, you pull your hands away, and the valve turns off, all automatic, right?
Right.
Versus a hand valve that you would turn on and off. That's very simpleton valving, but it kind of gets the point across of what the valve is doing.
So what are the applications for what you guys are putting your valves in place? And just to be clear, the solenoid valve is the one that sets on and off sort of automatically when you go to a bathroom, put your hands under the sensor versus like a manual valve that got it.
So if you wanted to control fluids and do it with a computer, automated control, and didn't want to have a human interface, you typically do it with electricity. And that's where the solenoid piece comes in. So the solenoid is actuating the valving components. And as I said, either turning something on or off or diverting. There's different types of valves, two-way valves, three-way valves. And they're used, you guys are probably using solenoid valves every day and you don't know it.
Okay.
The actual fuel injectors in your car are actual solenoids. And there's other pieces that in your car that are actually solenoid valve actuated. So they're in vehicles that people interface with every day. They're in control devices where you're trying to control, forces through cylinders, motion control. There'd be solenoids controlling that. And the big markets for us are automotive, which I brought up a couple of the applications, although we don't make fuel injectors, but there's other parts of the car that we're found on. Medical equipment and aerospace, oil and gas, drilling, transporting, distributing oil and gas. Those are some of the bigger markets.
So you mentioned that you guys are kind of in the spot of sort of solving the tough problems when it comes to solenoid valves. So like when you think about those tough challenges, like what are some of those tough challenges that you guys have solved?
So if someone has very high pressure, there's not a lot of companies that can handle very high pressure and do it safely.
Why is high pressure hard? What makes that more difficult then?
The containment piece, the force.
Meaning like when the valve's closed, you're getting a ton more force that you got to keep it closed for?
Ton more force in the valve that the valve has to function against, as well as contain. So if you can imagine a pressure vessel that builds up with pressure, the vessel itself is going to want to expand and potentially
Explode.
Explode. So containment and actually the forces inside can be tougher on the components and more difficult to shift against, requiring more power and efficient solenoids.
So is that like, so is the challenge, so they're saying when you get a tough challenge, it's about in the application, that's something a little bit more sort of run of the mill or simple. I'm not trying to disparage anyone that makes those, the automatic hand wash, the automatic valves for a sink, but it seems like a fairly straightforward application. You're operating in, generally speaking, ambient room temperature because people don't want a freezing bathroom or a very, very hot bathroom, and water pressure is probably reasonably manageable.
Right.
It's in a pipe that's designed to keep it from moving. Mm-hmm. That sounds like a pretty run of the mill application from your perspective.
Right.
But then you could be saying something in aerospace where you've got a plane flying at 48,000 feet at whatever hundreds of miles an hour, and maybe something under like its own internal pressure. And that's where like Peter Paul wants to come in and solve that challenge.
That's correct. So tough environments below the ocean, deep ocean, or high pressure, or actually low pressure ambient, like in an airplane. Typically tough environment, tough medias, tough pressures. That's where you guys have our niche. Yeah.
So you're kind of third generation, running the business. So your grandfather started it?
My grandfather did start it. Yeah. And, typical immigrant situation. He came from Sicily in the early 1900s as a young teenager, came through Ellis Island, and the rest of his family was going to follow. And the war got in the way, World War I. And I think his dad passed away, which would have been my great-grandfather. So he was alone. And I
got
think
sent over here as a teenager by himself?
Yeah.
Like he's the beachhead. He's the guy that's got to land
young
the beach.
teenager, too. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
You ever think about that? Like, could you imagine sending like your young teenage son across the world? It's like crazy, right? How times have changed.
Yeah. So he came across, the Italian community kind of absorbed him in, and he learned the barber trade, became a barber, eventually opened his own barber shops, and they evolved into hair salons. And after World War II, there was a warehouse in Connecticut that he put a bid on, and it was a closed-door warehouse auction. I'm not sure of the details, but I think he knew that it was full of copper. So he won the bid. The copper was in the form of magnet wire, which is typically what's wound on coils. Mm-hmm. And it also had winding equipment. And at the time, he decided that rather than flip the copper and make a quick buck, which he could have done because its copper was in short supply after World War II, he decided to get in the coil winding business. And so Peter Paul Coil was born. And that eventually evolved through the years into manufacturing solenoid valves. They were selling to various industries. Back in the 40s and 50s, it was the budding TV industry and the radio industry. They were making little inductors for their PC boards. And in the 60s, started selling to the solenoid valve world. And late 60s, decided to actually get involved and actually make their own solenoid valve line. And that eventually evolved into custom solenoids, and we're sort of a boutique solenoid valve manufacturer, engineered solutions, as I mentioned. And here we are today. My grandfather passed away in 1979, and the reins were turned over to the second generation at that point, and moved to third generation when my uncle passed away in 2010. Third generation started to step into the management roles at that point, and here we are.
And here we are today. Yeah. So I guess when you guys got into solenoids, we dropped the coil because now it's just Peter Paul.
Yeah, it was Peter Paul Coil Company. It evolved into Peter Paul Electronics and became incorporated as Peter Paul Electronics. And the name is actually still Peter Paul Electronics, but we don't market the electronics. We don't really make electronics.
Yeah.
So we've dropped that from our name as far as marketing goes. And
Got
just
it.
Peter Paul Valves
So
or just Peter Paul.
I'm going to ask a couple questions just because I think it's fascinating, which you may or may not know the answer. But what makes a guy who has hairdressing shops want to bid on a closed door bid on a warehouse? Like I'm not sort of putting those two together.
I wish I knew the inner details of that story. But it's a guy that would come over here from Sicily as a young teenager by himself,
Sure.
right?
Fair enough. Fair enough.
So yeah, he had some backbone for sure.
No question about it. And then you just buy this thing, you find the coil, and then decide, you know what, this barber thing and all that, forget that. I'm going to get into manufacturing. It's like pretty wild.
Yeah. So my grandmother used to joke. He went from curls to coils. That's a going joke. Yeah.
From curls to coils. I love it. And so did your dad kind of get you introduced into the business growing up? Is that where you sort of got interested?
So the business was around before I was born.
Sure, of
So
course.
I was born into it. My dad was fully engaged in the business when I was born. So, and it was much smaller at that point. So I was around the business, saw the equipment, the machines. I was attracted to that type of thing. I'm kind of a technical guy. My dad is as well. We kind of hit it off together, and I was always trying to figure out how things were working. And I spent a lot of time as a young child in the factory on weekends. No child labor there, but
Yeah. That's before people enforced child labor laws, right?
yeah. But I did spend quite a bit of time in the factory. Grew up with it, and as a teenager, actually formally started working there. And my dad, he cut his teeth on the floor as well. He came up through the floor machine. He's a machinist, and worked his way up into management. And so I was there with him as a teenager. I went to college, and after college, I took a different path. I wanted to make sure I can kind of do things on my own. So I spent 6 years working for Otis Elevator. And then my dad called and said, hey, we need some additional technical help. We're looking to grow our engineering department. If you're really interested and you want to come back, now's the time. So I came back and worked in the engineering department.
Did you talk to him before you took the job at Otis? Did you talk to him about, if that was the right path or go somewhere else? Was it something you did on your own?
He encouraged it. He encouraged going somewhere and seeing other things beyond the factory. And so it was a great opportunity for me. As Otis Elevator, you're probably aware, based here in Connecticut. And many people don't realize the technology that goes into an elevator. It's cutting edge. So having a chance to work there was great.
What is I know we're not really here to talk about Otis Elevator, but since you brought it up, I was just curious, what is some of the, the reason I'm going to ask this question is I think there's so many things that we do in our lives day to day that we don't think about. Like, for example, you mentioned, hey, you drive your car, you're using solenoid valves left and right in fuel injection. And there's all kinds of stuff in your car that people don't even understand what it takes to make it all work. So you just mentioned elevators are high tech. What was high tech about the elevator business, and what did you take away from that experience?
So I graduated as a controls engineer. Mm-hmm. And I worked in controls, and they were using, the big buzzword today is artificial intelligence. Well, this was in the 80s, and Otis Elevator was already using artificial intelligence in their algorithms. And you walk into a big high rise and you have 12 different elevators. Well, how does the elevator know which floor to go to, and which elevator should go to which floor to pick up which call button, right? It's actually pretty intricate, and a Otis Elevator started dabbling with artificial intelligence. They had,
To do what? To try and it's like, so you're saying, so if you think of a normal elevator, like the building we're in today is a 3-story building with an elevator, pretty simple,
Yeah,
probably technology. But you're sort of saying, hey, if you think about a building that's going to have like an elevator bank, that will have 4, 6, 8, 12 elevators and dozens of stories. The idea is, where do I got to position the elevators while they're waiting to make sure I can meet someone? You can't tell every elevator when you're done, go to the first floor. There's some type of technology that's going on in between there.
Right. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to minimize people's waiting time. Right. You got someone on the 34th floor trying to get to the 37th floor,
Right.
and you got someone on the 15th floor trying to get down to the lobby and everything in between. So how do you manage all of that with your bank of 8 or 12 elevators? Right. And
And so you were
technology.
working on that. When you say working on controls, you were kind of working in the part of the business that looks at that type of decision making, the control schemes for the whole elevator.
That was a little bit on the periphery.
Got it.
I was in a control. I was actually working on with a group that worked on sideways elevators. Shuttles.
Sideways?
Yeah, shuttles. We call ourselves the shuttle group. So if you go to an airport and you get on board a tram and it takes you from one building to the next, the doors open and close.
Yeah.
That was where I was working on that, and I was working on the control systems for that.
And what did you take from that experience and apply to your career at Peter Paul?
So it gave me a lot of application experience, which
What does that mean, application?
so how are things applied? How are controllers applied? There's actually solenoid valves in elevators too. The elevator.
These solenoid valves show up everywhere.
Yeah, they show up everywhere, and we actually sell it. It's a big market for us as well. So the elevator in your lobby, when you get on that and you push the button and you hear that whirring in the background, well, there's valves opening and closing, controlling that hydraulic fluid.
Sure.
Yeah. So, so I got a picture of the application side of things, not strictly the valve, right? And opened my eyes to how things are applied, right? Which is really what kind of turns my crank at Peter Paul. It's the application side of things, because there's elevators is just one little tiny application. There's these valves, as I mentioned, they go everywhere, and it's a fun part of the business to be able to go out and see where all this technology is used and how it's used.
And the company's like pretty sizable. When you say the word, like, we're a boutique firm, I think a lot of people here, when they hear the word boutique, they insert small as like as an attachment to it. And there's 140 people at your facility, kind of here in Connecticut, making things happen, which is sizable for any real manufacturing business. What's kind of gotten the growth going in the business? You mentioned it was smaller before, and it's grown in size. What sort of powered your growth and keeps you guys relevant?
It's been 100% organic. We have not acquired, and we haven't gotten into the M&A side of things. Peter Paul has grown completely organically, and it is through application engineering. And so we are in a position where we have a lot of different customers that do a lot of different things. It's a bit of a double-edged sword, because it takes a lot of overhead to support all of that. But we have a very strong application engineering department, which allows us to go dabble wherever we need to go dabble, and we just continue to nibble in and grow in that fashion. Where applications pop up, people have a problem to solve, we're pretty good at solving them with technical solutions. And so we grow in that manner.
And how do you guys are out there in the marketplace? Are you still relying, you're a sizable business. Are you still sort of relying on that relationships and word of mouth to grow? Are you guys out there, trade shows? What's your sort of go to market?
We have a pretty in-depth indentured website, which has been very helpful. We also hit key trade shows in the medical world as well as in oil and gas. There's actually a trade show coming up in Abu Dhabi, which we'll be heading out to. That'll be the first out of the country, well, out of the North America trade show that we're going to enter into, and we're working on more agency approvals that are more worldwide recognized to allow us to go play in some markets that are outside the North American market. So we're actually going to go kick the tires out there. But yes, trade shows, website. We have a sales force. I say force. There's a handful of folks in customer service and outside sales that we rely on.
And you're getting involved in that yourself too. Sounds like you're going to go to Abu Dhabi. Did I hear that right?
Yeah, I'm going to be making that trip out there.
Yeah, you like getting out there and rubbing elbows at the trade shows to see what else is out there?
Yeah, as I said, it's very interesting for me to actually go out there and see where these things are used. I think that's the key, and that's very fun for me. It's enjoyable, so I look forward to that.
One of the nice parts about running your own business is you get to do stuff that's fun. You got to do a lot of stuff maybe that isn't too, but at least
of course
you get to pick up some of that stuff. You know, speaking of your website, I was on your website and before the show, and there's a lot of comments around lean and lean manufacturing, sort of a core part of what Peter Paul is all about. Why do you take lean and put it on the website? Why is that such a driver of the business?
It's important for us because, first off, we're very vertically integrated. So we manufacture these solenoid valves, but we make almost everything that goes into the valve. We have 2 manufacturing facilities, and the primary one being here in central Connecticut. We also have a facility in Puerto Rico. So there's a lot of things happening, manufacturing happening in our plants. So making ourselves as efficient as we can is important, especially when we're dealing with many, many different parts, many, many different combinations and permutations of product that you can make to solve problems on the outside. So how do you support a low to medium volume, high mix business? How do you do that efficiently? And we found lean is an effective approach.
Yeah, listen, if you're going to try and be efficient and making money at a low volume, high mix business, you've got to be efficient, right? It's the only way to do it. So how have you looked at applying lean in a scenario where you have that combination of high mix, low volume?
So work cells, how do we make them adaptable? How do we try to make them and balance them in a way where you can achieve one single piece flow, and where you can't, what are some of the other lean tools that you can lean on, like Kanban, to get more of a lean approach? And also, how can we actually spread outside our 4 walls and get our vendors as well as our customers to approach lean and potentially the Kanban tools? So that's been going on since the early 2000s. We really dove in both feet with the lean approach, brought in some folks to help teach it to us. And it's been a journey, and it continues to be a journey.
Yeah, never ending, right? Never ending journey. Sure. Really important part to be successful. And obviously you guys have leaned on it. How have you been able to get, customers and vendors to kind of buy into it and help kind of smooth out that process? Because I can imagine in an environment where you've got the type of setup that you guys have, that getting sort of customers in particular to work with you can be really, really helpful to sort of manage the flow well.
Right. It's there's some teaching involved. And lean has been around for a while now, so sometimes there's no teaching needed. Sometimes you run into a customer or a vendor that really embraces it and says, yeah, let's go.
And they're on board.
This is the way to go.
Well, what are you asking your customers to do, though? Like, I would imagine maybe like order flow or volume or getting the orders done in a certain way. Maybe sometimes they got to wait a little bit longer to get it so that it works for you guys, but other times they get it, whatever.
Right, and that's the selling feature or the selling point of lean. You go to the customer and you say, okay, here we are, high mix, low volume. We're going to build to order, so your order is going to be stuck in a queue. And based on how busy we are, it may be deep in a queue somewhere. So how do we get rid of that time and get you product with shorter lead times? And that would be Kanban. So let's agree, and we'll put a formal agreement together where we'll put a couple of bins of material in, and they'll trigger a bin, we deliver, and it triggers us. It goes into the queue, and we've always got another bin full, so they can come and trigger at any time.
Anytime, yeah.
So typically, if it's done properly and balanced properly, the lead time ends up becoming travel time. How long is it going to take to ship from wherever we are in Connecticut to wherever you guys are?
That's great. And so obviously customers that already believe in that are really there. And since your customers tend to be other manufacturers, because you're not doing it with an end user, you're doing someone, so they're probably buying into this thing, which has made it probably a lot easier for you to leverage it.
Yep, absolutely.
That's great. How about from a technology perspective? Like, are you guys able, sounds like it's a pretty high tech business. Are you guys, is it as high tech as it sounds in terms of what it takes to make these solenoid valves?
Yeah. And that's actually some of the challenges. We've been in business manufacturing solenoid valves since the 60s. And we have processes that have been around since the 60s. And we have equipment that's been around since the 60s, right? So how do you take that? How do you take some of this old batch-oriented equipment, lean it out, and move it onto newer equipment? How do you balance that? And that has been a lot of our focus over the last 15 years or so, modernizing the plant floor. And the machine tools today are smart, right? And they're more tuned to smaller batches, more complex geometry, whereas in the past, 60s and 70s, you had blanking machines that were difficult to set up, took, several days to set up, and took some significant talent, dedicated type tools. And once they were up and running, you wanted to amortize this very long setup across
Which
a very
does not
large
lend
batch.
itself to lean at all.
No. So how do you take that type of manufacturing and lean it out? It's been a challenge, and modernize over time, because some of these new machine tools are quite expensive. So we've been investing a lot into that since the mid 2000s, 2004, 2005. We really jumped in and took the lean approach, leaned out where we could, started the modernization process. And we're still on that journey, as I said.
Well, dude, I mean, modernization and all that, just like lean, sort of never ending, right? I mean, every time you get a new machine, it doesn't take long before someone's got some new tweak or twist to make that thing happen. You had mentioned sort of in passing earlier that you guys have a facility in Puerto Rico. How did that come to pass?
So in the early 70s, we were not only making coils, but now we're making the valve components here in Connecticut. And the facility we were in was sort of busting at the seams. We were just too big for the facility. So my grandfather decided to actually try to find a place bigger, or move a piece of it out. And at the time, Puerto Rico rolled out the red carpet and said, hey, why don't you bring some of your business here? There's some tax incentives. And my grandfather went down there. It actually reminded him a lot of Sicily, where he's from. So that had a lot of pull on him.
I bet it did, yeah.
And so the decision was made in the early 70s to actually move the coil production down to Puerto Rico. And my uncle, he looked at his two sons, and they were running the business with him, my dad and my uncle, and asked which one wanted to go down there to set up shop. My uncle ended up deciding to go. He went down there. I think the facility was purchased in 1971, and the coils were being manufactured down there in 1972. And then the traditional machining and assembly, it always remained here in Connecticut.
And is it still doing coils down there, or what are you guys doing at that facility?
It is. It's still making coils. The injection mold bobbins, wind coils, encapsulate coils. There's also some metal stamping operations that are down there, some elastomer molding that happens down there. And it's primarily to feed the business in Connecticut with components that are needed in the solenoid valve.
Nice. And so it's worked out. Plus, you get a nice kind of warm spot to go travel for business in the winter.
Yeah, it's great in the wintertime.
Gets a little hot down there in August, but yeah, it's pretty good. That's really cool, Mark. What's next for Peter Paul? We got a fourth generation engaged. What's the future look like?
So my kids have all taken the medical route. My kids are the oldest of the fourth generation, and they're all in either nursing or pharmacy. But there's a lot of other fourth generation that are waiting in the wings. My brother, his kids are probably the next in line, and I have a cousin. Her kids are about the same age. Some of them are in business school, so we'll see.
Could happen.
We'll see. Yeah. Fourth generation's right around the corner.
Yeah, it is. Always seems to happen. So I'm going to ask you a few last questions, and we'll wrap it up. So, first question is: if you had to do something other than be the president of Peter Paul, and it could be anything in the whole wide world, what would you spend your time doing?
Oh, what would I spend my time doing? Well, I do enjoy getting out there. As I said, the application side of things always intrigued me, but beyond that, it's just seeing different sites. So something involving some travel would be fun. As I said, this trip to Abu Dhabi, it's my first time in the Middle East. So I'm looking forward to that. Yeah.
You're working in that travel into your current life. I love it. Way to be. Do you have a favorite business book?
Favorite business book? I don't know if I have a favorite. I have an interesting one. It's called Energy Leadership, and it talks about energy that people have and how to understand people's energy, and kind of puts it into words. I would recommend. It's very easy read.
Energy Leadership.
Energy Leadership.
I haven't heard of it. That's a good one. Mark, what's something that you learned early in your life or early in your career that you think's helped propel you to all the success you've had?
I learned that fear can squelch any objective, or at least add a lot of time to making it come to fruition. So understanding that is the first step, and then dealing with it.
And what have you learned about how to deal with it and push through?
Sometimes fear is going to be there, so you need to recognize it. Fear of failure, fear of what people are going to think of you, how they're going to see you, and first recognize it, and then second, do something about it. Pull the trigger.
Make it happen.
Yeah.
I think I heard someone once say the only thing to fear is fear itself. So there
absolutely.
you go. Mark, what's something you learned later in your life or later in your career that if you could go back in time and tell young Mark, and if he'd listen to you, you'd think it'd make a real positive impact on his life?
Well, I would say, being a technical guy, growing up and focusing on the technical side of things has been fun. It's been easy, but there's a people aspect to everything. And maybe focusing on some of that earlier in my career would have been helpful.
Did you get around to focusing on it over time?
I did.
How did a lot of people that are very technical, I think, listen to this podcast and certainly engaged in the manufacturing space for sure. What did you do to sort of work out that other side of yourself? And
So when I came to Peter Paul as an engineer, worked in the engineering department, eventually ran the engineering department. And in 2010, my uncle passed away. So the third generation, which was actively in the business, my brother and some cousins kind of got together and said, hey, we got to think about succession, right? And my cousin, brighter than I am, he said, yeah, we probably need to bring some help in, put some formal governance structure in play. We have a board, but we need to formalize it, put a family council into play. And so at that point, we decided to bring in some professional talent, brought in a clinical psychologist that specializes in family business, and that's been very helpful and eye-opening, and was
A clinical psychologist.
yeah.
How does that, you gotta elaborate on that a little bit. How does that engage and where does that impact?
So here we were, third generation, right? And we all grew up, in it's cousin syndicate. So cousins have, grew up different than
Sure.
my brother and I.
Of course.
And we communicate different, have different goals, right? And we have a business as well. We have 140-ish people here in Connecticut, another 40 or 45 in Puerto Rico. So just how do we deal with all these people? How do we deal with ourselves? How do we decide who's doing what and how we're going to succeed the business? And we better get some professional help to do this, because maybe my ideas are not the same as your ideas, and maybe to be able to sift through that, someone can help us at least communicate better and get all this stuff on the table.
And it worked.
Yeah, it worked great. I would strongly recommend doing this with any business, any management system,
Really?
any management team. Yeah.
When you think about kind of the one or two or maybe three, whatever handful of sort of like eye-opening aha moments that you got through this process, what do you think about? What are some of the things that after you went through the other side, you were like, whoa, that was pretty awesome?
Yeah. Well, primarily, you can control your thoughts, and you have your needs and wants, and other folks have their thoughts and their needs and wants, and you can't control them, right? But you can understand them and you can empathize with them, right? So how do you learn to do that, right? And then find common ground.
Wow, that's worth a lot if you can get there, and especially if you can get through it on family. That's pretty cool. Mark, thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing your story and your experience. It's been really interesting, and I appreciate you spending the time.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me.
Made in America with Ari Santiago is brought to you by Compass MSP.
Thanks for listening and spending some time with me today. My goal is to help build a strong manufacturing community, and it would be impossible to do without all of you.